The Old Masters, edited by Brian Davis, is a book that I picked up on eBay after being intrigued by this cover art and also this editor, Brian Davis, who I hadn't heard of before. And when I went to look up Brian Davis, I mistakenly, in my previous video, claimed that he was a Christian fantasy writer, but actually I got that wrong. Brian Davis is a figure who doesn't seem to have written any other books, and it's really difficult to find any information out there about him. By looking at the speculative fiction database, I discovered that Brian Davis is actually the real name of a comic illustrator called Michael Folks, primarily known for his work in the UK in the Daily Telegraph. It's also really difficult to find any information about Brian Davis or this book because at the time of recording, this only has 10 ratings on Goodreads and 2 written reviews. Now, Goodreads isn't necessarily the most useful resource if you are a science fiction fan, particularly because a lot of these older works have faded into obscurity, particularly when they are collections or anthologies of science fiction short stories which aren't as widely read today as they once were. But nevertheless, it is fairly unusual in my experience to find a book with such a low number of ratings and reviews, which got me intrigued as to what this is, what it contains, and whether it is any good. So, to answer the first question, this is an anthology of science fiction short stories from the golden age of science fiction, collected from various different science fiction magazines, referring to the writers included as Old Masters, which is a term that is used in the art world to reference classic painters and artists. And some of the authors in here are really big, well-known names who have stood the test of time while others have faded into obscurity. So what I'm going to do in this video is break down each short story included in here with a quick summary and then provide my overall thoughts at the end. There is a very quick preface from Brian Davis or Michael Folks, and then there is a short introduction by science fiction editor John Carnell, who was an editor for some of the science fiction magazines that these stories have been collected from. And he states that even though he has probably some personal bias and nostalgia towards some of these writers and these stories, he thinks that this is a great selection to illustrate how these writers were stepping beyond some of the norms at the time and showcasing some ability that would aid them in their longer form work, which turned out to be true because a lot of these writers went on to be incredibly successful. The first story in here is by Murray Leinster. I'm not entirely sure if I'm saying that right. And in the introduction and the preface, Carnell and Davis are really heaping on the praise for Murray Leinster in particular, referring to him as the oldest master because he was writing science fiction short stories in the 1920s. Interestingly, at the beginning of every one of these stories, there is an accompanying illustration, and I'll just show you the one here for the first story, Tight Place by Murray Leinster. So you can see the illustration that I'm talking about there, showing that astronaut drifting through space. And at the beginning of the book, it says that the illustrations have been specially drawn for this collection by Terry Diggins. Now again, I looked up Terry Diggins and I could find absolutely no information about him. My personal theory here is that Diggins is also Brian Davis, who is also Michael Folks. So there is a little bit of mystery surrounding this one, and if you do know anything about Davis or Diggins, let me know, because I did go down a little bit of an internet rabbit hole trying to figure out who these people are. But anyway, the first story, Tight Place by Murray Leinster, opens with an astronaut being knocked unconscious and jettisoned into space following a space battle with another ship. He awakens to find that he is spiraling uncontrollably in the void, and he really utilizes this calm state of mind to figure out a way that he can use the tools available to him both within his suit and attached to his tool belt to manipulate physics in such a way that he can potentially get himself to safety. I think this is a fairly well written story, And there are some quite panic-inducing moments when you put yourself in this character's position, hurtling through space, spiraling out of control with a dwindling oxygen supply. And that story was first published in Astounding Science Fiction in July 1945. So all of these stories are from the 40s or 50s. The next story here is a collaboration between James Blish and Damon Knight, and once again you can see the illustration there, which shows this woman levitating above these onlooking men. And this one is about a group of scientists on an alien world, which is home to nothing but the ruins of a long extinct civilization. And they are experimenting with a new branch of science referred to as ultronics, taking the form of this belt that attaches to a person and allows them to levitate or effectively fly. They are testing this technology on this alien planet because it is said to be extremely dangerous, and it could potentially result in an explosion so catastrophic that it could wipe out an entire world. And the government of Earth are not allowing these scientists to test it on their home planet. This one goes in a really unexpected direction, which is potentially a little bit too far-fetched in terms of its central concept, but I do think that the scope is impressive, particularly for the time, because that one was published in Astounding Science Fiction in 1948. Next up is Uncommon Sense by Hal Clement, and this one was published in Astounding Science Fiction again in 1945. Here is the accompanying illustration, showing a man pouring some kind of substance into the ground. And this one follows a man who has crashed on an alien planet and is holed up in a cave to protect himself from the immense heat and radiation that's being given off by this planet's sun. Fairly nearby, he can see an enemy ship, but he can't reach it because of that heat and radiation that I just mentioned. While he's in this cave, he starts to witness these strange native life forms of this planet, which take the shape of these kind of crab beings, these walking crustaceans, and these enormous flowing centipedes. And he needs to creatively utilize his environment and these native beings to find a way to get inside the enemy spaceship and escape this planet. So it's a bit of a survivalist tale, and the way that he does that without spoiling is incredibly clever, and I really enjoyed this story too. Next up is 1 into 2 by J.T. McIntosh, published in Science Fantasy in 1951, and the accompanying illustration features these characters looking like they are up to no good. And this one is set in a world where there is this teleportation technology allowing people to travel instantaneously between Earth, the Moon, and Mars. And because the potential to exploit this technology is so high, the teleportation centers are under strict government control, and we're following a character here who is attempting to get to Mars and murder his ex-girlfriend's husband using the teleportation technology to formulate a completely robust alibi. This one, in terms of the themes, the style, and the execution, reminded me a fair bit of Alfred Bester, which is a huge compliment. Then we've got Criminal Record by Brian Aldiss, published in Science Fantasy in 1954. Supposedly, this was Brian Aldiss's first published science fiction short story. Here's the accompanying illustration, which features this fellow with something strange going on with his neck. And I've become quite a big fan of Brian Aldiss, so reading some of his early work here was quite intriguing. This follows a man who is rummaging around in an antique shop when he finds what he believes to be an old vinyl record. What this actually turns out to be, though, is a video recording from the future, which is from the archives of Earth's police force, who are combating a bizarre alien race from the planet Venus. And this one actually has a setup and an ending that I thought was quite scary. Then we've got Dark Interlude by Mac Reynolds and Frederick Brown from Galaxy in 1951. And the introductory paragraph for this story says that Mac Reynolds and Frederick Brown were frequent collaborators and also raised goats together, which I'm not sure what that's all about. But again, here is the illustration for this one, which shows a guy aiming a double-barreled shotgun. And this is about a man in the far future in the USA being sent back in time on a one-way trip because the historical records of the past have all been destroyed. So this far future civilization don't really know their own history, and they've developed this time travel technology to send someone back, record what's going on at the time, and then bury that information in a time capsule that can then be retrieved by the future civilization. When this guy is sent back in time, he finds himself in a rural American town and quickly falls in love with a woman who is living with her brother. This one, almost the entire way through, I thought was going to end up being this pulpy time travel romance. But then the ending is extremely shocking and flipped the whole thing on its head for me and ended up being a really good read. Then we've got The Monster by A.E. Van Vogt, published in Astounding Science Fiction in 1948. Here is the illustration for that one, which features these figures looking at a skeleton. And this is about a race of alien beings coming to Earth and discovering that all living beings have been completely wiped out, and all that remains of humanity are these skeletons strewn throughout the world. But these alien beings have a technology that can reclaim the cells from skeletons and reconstruct the individual that those cells came from. So they take a few of these skeletons and they bring them back to life and interrogate them as to the nature of this extinction event. And what they discover is that humanity are not as we know them and are potentially a much bigger threat. I thought this one was okay. Again, has a pretty massive scope with some airy-fairy ideas that I wasn't 100% on board with. Then we've got The Red Stuff by John Wyndham, published in Marvel Science in 1951. And again, I've become quite a big fan of John Wyndham. And this one, wait, here's the illustration, which shows this sort of gelatinous thing. And this one kind of has that same slow building dread that Wyndham has become so well known for, as it follows a group of astronauts who encounter this asteroid belt where some of the asteroids have been taken over by this red gelatinous slime substance, which appears to be continually growing, and some of it gets onto their ship and starts taking over the ship completely. This one reminded me a bit of Solaris, and I thought it was a really good read. Then we've got Inheritance by Arthur C. Clarke, published in New Worlds in 1948. And Arthur C. Clarke is someone who is an important writer for me personally, probably the person that got me into science fiction reading in the first place. I see a lot of people knocking him these days, calling him dull and boring, and stating that he's not a good writer. I don't always agree with that criticism, but I do think that this story is probably the weakest one in this collection, or at least one of the weakest ones. Here is the illustration, which shows this man and his deflated parachute. And this one is just about some astronauts who are working on some satellite technology and are returning to Earth, falling from orbit and using a parachute to land safely. But it does encompass one of the man's dreams, which appear in some way to be potentially reflecting reality. I just thought, when compared to some of these other stories which have some of these big ideas and extensive scopes, this is a more grounded, despite the orbital nature of the story, tale focusing on some of the hard science concepts, and ends up just being a little bit uninteresting to me. And then lastly, we've got The Odour of Thought by Robert Sheckley, published in New Worlds in 1954. Here is the illustration for that story, which shows this man facing off against these wolf creatures. And that's exactly what this story is about, really. He is a kind of intergalactic mailman, and he crashes on this alien world. and discovers all of these green furry beings who have no nose or mouth, and he witnesses them hunting each other and starts to speculate on how they are actually sensing each other's presence. And he realizes that they are actually using telepathy. And so these green furry wolf and panther-like beings suddenly detect his own thoughts and start trying to hunt and eat him. And he has to manipulate his own thoughts in order to deter or distract these alien creatures in a way that I thought was amusing, creative, and culminates in an ending which was quite thought-provoking. So that's everything in here. I have been actively trying to read more science fiction short stories this year because I've been neglecting them in recent years, and they obviously form such an important part of this tapestry of the genre as a whole. And I do think that this is a pretty good selection of short stories, which I think could have quite easily been pulpy and randomly selected, but it seems like Brian Davis here has looked for these stories that are pushing a little bit beyond where many of the writers were at the time, and showcasing how science fiction was starting to take these steps into new territories, exploring new ideas and concepts. So even though this one has completely faded into obscurity, and I will end up being only the third person to review it on Goodreads, I think it was a worthwhile read, and it's only 120 pages, so I got through it in a couple of days. So let me know if you've read any of the short stories that I've discussed here today. Let me know if you've ever heard of this book or Brian Davis. Let me know if you've heard of this mystery illustrator, Terry Diggins, who I think is Brian Davis, but there's every chance that I am wrong on that one. Apologies for the lighting in this video. It is late and I don't have a professional setup. I should probably look into doing that now that I am approaching 900 subscribers, so thank you very much again for watching, liking and subscribing. And actually on that note, before I sign off, I just wanted to highlight a channel that I have been watching and enjoying lately. When I was fairly new to making YouTube videos, a few bigger creators did shout me out and showcase my channel in their videos, which helped me to grow this channel. And so I do want to pay that forward a little bit, and I want to start doing this a bit more from now on, where I do spot these smaller channels or these newer channels that you guys might not be aware of, because I do think it's always important to seek out other perspectives. And this channel is called Barely Human. He is a young guy who at the time of recording only has 14 subscribers with 10 videos, and even though he's still fairly new, I think the quality of his videos is incredibly good in terms of the visual quality, the editing, and the presentation. But also, he does have this fresh perspective on some of the books that he's discussing. And you guys in the comments have been incredibly insightful with your own knowledge, giving me some new perspectives on some of the things that I'm talking about, or pointing me in new directions in terms of suggestions and recommendations. So go and check out Barely Human's channel. I think he already deserves way more than 14 subscribers. And if there are other smaller, newer channels that you've been watching and enjoying, let me know in the comments because I'd like to check them out. That's everything for today. I'll see you on the next one.